Hey everyone, it's me Josh. Welcome to Story Time. If you like these, please subscribe, click that bell below. Today we're going to be reading Mr. Noisy. Oh yeah. Hope you like reading these stories with me, guys. I love reading books. Books are great. Today we're going to be delving into this one. So get ready, get comfortable, because we're about to go into Story Time. That's right. Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Do you think Mr. Noisy will be loud or quiet? Loud, yeah. Bit noisy? Maybe. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person, indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting it at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. Mr. Noisy reading a book. Looks like he's yelling there. Ah! Oh, here we go. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But, achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Wow, Mr. Noisy sneezing there. I live in Los Angeles in America. Can you imagine if I sneezed and wherever you are in the world, if you're in a different country and you could hear me sneeze? That is so loud. My friend's family back in Australia, wow, wild. Wonder if people here around this place, do you think they could hear me sneeze? Just local? Yeah? Think it would be a bit noisy? Yeah. Now this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in his bedroom, in his bed, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, Mr. Noisy snores. When Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Wow, that's quite loud. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. So when his alarm goes off, it looks like it's about 7 o'clock there, right? 7 o'clock in the morning. That goes off, looks like everybody in the town has to wake up. That's how loud it is. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, and the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. You're like, whoa. Whoa. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as she shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as she shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Look at him there, his arms are wide. And I suppose express that he's always loud. And his big gestures here, like, ah! 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 Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy went shopping again. Clump, clump, clump. He went down to Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry? What did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out, and went home, and went to bed. Hungry. Look, he doesn't look too happy there. It's not good to be hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. A loaf of... And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home, up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Big loud footsteps. The worm down here doesn't look super happy about how loud he is each step. Then he stopped and he thought. And then you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Look at him go, tiptoeing up the hill there. And extra quiet. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put his hand to open the door and then he stopped and then he thought. And then you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That was fun too. Look at him happy there, kicking back, relaxing. It's like, ooh, I can be quiet now. Fun. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon there. The bottom of the hill, Noisy's house up there. Mr. Noisy, oh, sorry there, Marshall. Mr. Noisy has learned how to, what do you think it might be? Whisper. Isn't that interesting? Mr. Noisy learns how to whisper. A very quiet way of talking. Well, that's about all we have time for today. If you like these, please subscribe, click the bell below, and you can read these stories with me whenever you want. Hope you liked Mr. Noisy today. Thanks so much for reading with me. Bye for now, but not forever. See you soon.